Mm.
Namaskar and welcome to this interview series in the fourth edition of Expert Speak, initiated by the Asian Institute of Diplomacy and International Affairs in 2020. AIDIA is a non-partisan think tank that for the past 10 years has been looking into the developments within the geopolitical, economic, and security landscape in the Himalayan region, focusing on South Asia. Expert Speak is a platform where scholars, policy experts, and practitioners bring in their experience and share their knowledge on the existing and emerging trends in international relations. For this interview session, we have with us Dr. Chandra Dev Bhatta, a political scientist who frequently writes and comments on geopolitics and foreign policy. Having been trained at the London School of Economics and the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, he holds expertise in Nepali politics, international relations, geopolitics, and international political economy. Several of his writings are available in popular national dailies, as well as other digital platforms like the Observer Research Foundation, or the ORF, and the International Politics and Society magazine. He has been a leading voice in Nepal's think tank space, with his recent podcast on Sushant Pradhan's YouTube channel providing valuable insights on Nepal-India relations. This episode of Expert Speak delves into the deeper understanding of current geopolitical trends that impact South Asia. It is truly a privilege to have him join us today. Thank you so much for being a part of Expert Speak, sir.
Thank you, man. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for being here, sir. So to start off with the interview, I want to begin with what you said very recently in an interview. Much has happened in the past year, and I really would like to address what you recently said in the print interview with the Kathmandu Post on the issue of pragmatism in diplomacy, noting that global geopolitics is not moving in the right direction. What were the most noteworthy or rather prominent geopolitical shifts that you observed in the past year, in 2024?
Thank you, Swetama. Very interesting question. In fact, let's try to reflect on the fact that why do we talk about why I said pragmatic foreign policy there. I think we all are aware of the fact that foreign policy, the principles of the foreign policy, normally they don't change, they remain static for a long period of time. The only changes when there are fundamental changes within the country, when there is a revolutions in the country, then they changes. They changes when there are changes in at the neighborhood as well. And they changes when the international politics has changes fundamentally. So if we look at from this perspective, we don't really see two things happening. Like there is no major change domestically in Nepal's domestic politics, because that took place few years back, 2005, 2006, and we don't see major changes in the neighborhood as well. Our neighborhood is largely stable. But there are changes at the global politics. If you look at everybody talks about it, the word we've been frequently using geopolitics for that. So these changes that have taken place at the global level will just certainly have a great deal of impact on our foreign policy orientations as well. That's why this is where we have to be more pragmatic. Then we have to really reflect on what are the changes that have happened at the global level during the last couple of years. That's quite an important. I think one of the most important change is the multipolarity has come up. The multilateralism somehow has been fallen under shadow of multipolarity. Although multipolarity is not new for Nepal, it has always been a multipolar world for Nepal. There was always a Beijing, New Delhi, London, Brussels, or Washington. Nepal has been dealing with the multipolar world for a long period of time. But the way multipolarity has come up in recent years is has really become a concern for all of us. Primarily because these multipolar power centers are coming up with their own sets of rules and regulations. Like these rules and regulations are largely defined by them. The multipolar power centers might be good for a powerful countries because they are the one who come up with these ideas. But countries like Nepal always get benefited when multilateralism is in order. But somehow the multilateral institutions that were developed in 1945 are in flux, are not really that stable. So this all these changes demands not only Nepal but many other countries like Nepal to have a more pragmatic foreign policy, in a sense that they can really address the challenges brought about by the changes at the global level. Then the second point perhaps we'll have to look into is the what is the problem with regard to the foreign policy that Nepal has been conducting for a long period of time. I think we need to look into one or two aspects here. The first is the somehow when the world politics has changed, the debate in the country somehow is not really changed in our context. If we look at, we are still somehow hooked up with the old debate. The largely the old debate, which perhaps will not really be helpful to we address the challenges today's geopolitical challenges. The second point is the our foreign policy is largely the ideological. It's more ideological. When we have ideological foreign policy, that foreign policy will not really be able to look into the challenges or the challenges that have come up in the world politics, because our engagement has increased, not only the engagement of the state, but if we look at the engagement of the people at the global level, if you look, has fundamentally changed. Then that also demands us to, that somehow creates a problem for the foreign policy as well. Yeah. Then the second point is somehow, we've always been divided between East and West. These types of, this only puts a lot of pressure on foreign policy, foreign policy aspects as well, because these are not really the real, the real these East versus West. They are into the minds of people's mind, but they certainly put a lot of pressure on the foreign policy. So that somehow creates a great deal of problems for us to design a foreign policy that can really work for the country. The third point perhaps we'll have to look into is the way the old order that we all talk about. The old order somehow is not really not it's still there, but somehow it's not really working the way it used to work. The new order is not, it has not really it has not come up. Then in that context, then we perhaps will have to be more practical, pragmatic in pragmatic foreign policy. These all changes demand us to have a more pragmatic foreign policy, because if we don't have a pragmatic foreign policy, then a lot of our issues, be it development, be it any other, so these all issues will not really be, we cannot really look into them very carefully. So that's these are the few factors where the foreign policy, our foreign policy has to be more pragmatic rather than being more emotional or more emotional. Somehow, the foreign policy debate is largely driven by the emotional factors as well. But the countries, be it whether they are big powers or small powers, they always look for their own interests. So if we really wanted to fulfill the objectives of the foreign policy, there is a great deal of need to have a pragmatic foreign policy. Perhaps, at least if we look at the changes that are taking place in the world politics, these all demand to have a pragmatic foreign policy. Then, as you said, the second point is what are the major changes that happened in the year 2024 in the geopolitical sector. I think the Lenin once said, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happens. So if you look at from that perspective, in 2024, many things happens. Elections took place in more than 70 countries. So not only they were not the normal elections, the elections, the Americans went for elections. The election was in our neighborhood, in India, in many parts of the world. So these elections were quite important because people were talking about these, because these elections were fought between the liberal values or the illiberal values, democratic or anti-democratic discourses were there. Then there were some new geopolitical flashpoints as well emerged in 2024. If you look at, there were of course these geopolitical flashpoints were building up for a long period of time, but the conflict or war in the West Asia has taken a new turn with the downfall of Assad regime in Syria. Then the increased violence in the between Israel in the Gulf region. Then again in the South China Sea. If you look at the tensions, then the Russia-Ukraine conflict. These are the some of the new geopolitical. Then again, if you look at the technology, has different types of moment. The competition or competition between China and the US, if you look at. So that has brought some sort of new dynamism in the geopolitics itself. So it's not only the geopolitics, somehow the geopolitics and the geoeconomics both have intertwined during the last couple of years. So these all incidents will have a great deal of impact, not only in the region, but also we know the world is interconnected. They will also have an impact in our own country. If you look at South Asia, the of course, apart from the elections in India, the Bangladesh has seen major changes. There is a regime change, sort of a regime change after a long period of time. Sheikh Hasina has to fled the country, and the new government has come up, but we really don't know how things will pan out in the days to come. Then the crisis in Myanmar is very volatile. So South Asia is very looks quite the geopolitical incident in the region. There are a lot of things happening in the South Asia. Same goes for the West Asian region as well. Apart from the conflict in the other parts of the world, the Africa, 30 almost I think around 30 countries in African continent are in conflict. So 2024, if we see these all incidents, is not really a normal year. A lot of geopolitical flashpoint, a lot of conflicts. It's not only the conflict, but also the some sort of the trade war is also building up. So the year comes up with the year 2025 comes up with a lot of uncertainty, I would say. Yes.
Definitely. So I think it touched upon a lot of important points, including multipolarism,
Multipolarity.
the divisions, multipolarity, pardon me, the divisions that have been very, very much apparent in the past year, the cases that kind of erupted in this situation of uncertainty. So there are a lot of different things that you touched upon, including the global, the regional, and the domestic. So I want to start with the global. Because you spoke on elections, you spoke on the intertwined nature of geopolitics and geoeconomics. I think something that really caught the world's focus last year was the US elections. And the trepidations that were associated with Trump 2.0. So I think I want to tackle that first. So following this, there have been a lot of contemplations on how a second Trump presidency would look like in this, as you said, uncertain global political environment. Also concerning the geoeconomic factors, when you see how the tariff question has been lingering on everyone's mind, as you pointed out, the emerging or the slowly brewing contemplations of trade wars. So where do you think that the Trump administration will put its focus on when coming to the major insecurities that you just noted, right? Do you perceive much turbulence in the near future when you look at the change in leadership broadly?
I think that's quite an interesting question as well. Everybody talks about how things will unfold as as Donald Trump takes over the charge in Washington. Uh, I think there are two important factors we need to take into consideration when we talk about the new American administrations. The first is we have to try to understand the America as a state, which has been a superpower for a long period of time, and America definitely wanted to maintain that status quo, status at least for. Of course, every country would do the same thing if they reach into that position. So that American, the what we call American exceptionalism, they have been there for a long period of time. So the second point is the Trump as a person. Trump as a person, it's overall at the end of the day, it's the people who will drive the foreign policy. So of course, Trump is not really a classical political leader. He comes from a business background. He's a billionaire. So whatever he wanted to do, he will always look for a profit as the, so that he's overall he's a profit-making business person. So his entire administration will be guided by this philosophy. That's my own assumption. Overall, he is also the president of the U.S. and he cannot really sideline the American priority as well. So these two factors will determine the future course of action. But also another important point is Donald Trump is also seen as a mercurial person, in terms of decision making. There is no clarity, what is he going to say and what action he is going to take. So we cannot really predict. But then the third point we really need to talk about here is the some of the statement he has made during this transition period, which has become which are widely discussed in the media and outside the media as well. People are quite concerned about the statement which he has made. There are two or three statements, all of us know about them. First, he said he wanted to, he said he's going to go for a tariff. He wanted to increase the tariff, not only with his rivals, China, but also with his friends like Mexico and Canada. He said he's going to impose a tariff. That's quite an important part. Both Mexico are the major, and China are the major trading partners of the US. The second point, he rightly said, right in the face of the Canadian Prime Minister, that he said the Canada should become a 51st state of the US. That's right, that's what he said. The third point is, the third statement he made was he wanted to take over the Greenland, right? These three statements somehow has they've created some sort of unease in the world of international politics, if you can say so. Then he also said he wanted to change the name of Gulf of Mexico to the American Gulf, the Gulf of Mexico to the American Gulf, something like that. So these are some of the statements which has created some sort of uproar. So in the international politics, the second point is then the statement, the Europeans are already, quite concerned about his statement. He also wanted to take Europeans to take some sort of responsibility, with regard to the NATO. Right? He wanted them to pay for that. Pay for the security that NATO has been providing, largely the Americans has been providing. So if Trump really we really don't know whether he said it just for the sake of saying, or he really wanted to put them into the action. there is or he has come up with for the bargaining approach. There is something called madman theory on the political science. Is these statements are a part of a madman theory, or is he really going to implement them? If he really comes up with, if he really tries to implement these policies, that definitely will create a lot of problems in the world politics, apart from the uncertainty that we are already witnessing. If the trade war, if he goes for a trade war with the China, or the tariffs, so if he increases the tariff, so that will not only affect China, but it will also affect other countries as well. Like, we are also the countries like Nepal as well, because global economy somehow has been interconnected for during the last couple of years. So that interconnectedness will have a great deal of impact. Perhaps this could be the reason, among others, why countries are trying to prepare themselves, for the future, because they're not quite sure what action, how Trump will react when he assumes power in the White House. So that's quite an interesting part. The other part, like, I think other factor we really will have to take into consideration is the apart from these policies, he will also have specific policies for the specific regions, because American foreign policy is not decided by the territory, as other countries do. So anything that happens when the world, not only in the bhulo, but also in the Akash Lok and the Patal Lok, that impacts American policy. That impacts American foreign policy. So a lot of factors will have to be taken into considerations. If you look at the Trump 1.0, he came up with the Indo-Pacific strategy. Like that Indo-Pacific strategy will have, so will. I think that he definitely will go for that. He will try to push that strategy ahead. If he does that, the countries, largely the countries in this part of the world, in South Asia, that will have impact here. Like in the other regions as well. Like, he said, I think during the transition period, he became more proactive than any other American president in the past. If we go by the statements, even by his actions, he said he wanted to end the Russia-Ukraine war on the day first when he assumes office. Like he's already working on ending the war in the West Asian regions. But these all initiatives, or these all steps which President-elect has undertaken will have a impact. So 2-3 factors I think will have to, just to summarize it. One is the way he made his statement. Of course, if they are really implemented, that will not only have consequences for those countries and the region, but that will also create a problem in other parts of the world. Then that perhaps the larger, bigger countries might take it as a precedent. They can do it for their own. Like countries can do anything for their security. That will send a wrong message, right? The second one is the tariff. Then the economy will feel a lot of heat in the days to come. So, like, so the third one is the new flashpoint that have re-emerged in different parts of the world. So all these factors will play a great role in 2025. So that's why perhaps a lot of commentators have said, talked about the uncertainty. Like on top of that, as we earlier talked about the international, the order, the order per se. The order itself is in flux. When multilateralism is not really working, and multiple power centers are creating their own rules and regulations, then that does not really benefit countries like Nepal. That is again to reiterate the idea behind the pragmatic foreign policy comes more prominent here.
Yes, it's very interesting how these mercurial interests will play out in the future, right? It's going to be a very, very long term, I think, for a lot of people to predict and project their their perceptions. You pointed out something, and I wanted to sort of move on with that. You pointed out the issue of South Asia and how when you look at the region, it is currently in a flux right now, right? When you see all of these elements sort of moving around and the kind of uncertainty that pervades the geopolitical space right now, or the spaces right now, how do you see the prospect of regional integration when moving forward? Where are the traditional, I mean, you already pointed this out, but I actually wanted to go further into the new trends that you spoke about and the traditional fault lines that are already existing in the space. And at the present time, in the current moment, who are the relevant actors who are playing here in this regional space?
The idea of regional integration, I think, it's a very a lot of countries do talk about it even these days, but somehow the idea of regional integration in South Asia is not really going well. The way it was, expected to go, or it was envisaged in the very beginning. I think before talking about the regional prospectus of regional integration in the region, we should try to understand South Asia as a region itself. That I think that's quite an important. From my, that's what I think it's quite important to know. If you look at South Asia, I really don't want to go too far, but just let's go back to the history during the last 3 or 4 decades. The war on terror happened in South Asia. The South Asia was the epicenter of war on terror. War that began in 2000, so after the Twin Tower incident. So the war on terror has created different types of momentum for the region. So then after, then the second factor that, when we talk about the regional integration with regard to South Asia is the new geopolitics. The epicenter of new geopolitics is also in South Asia. Like two things, to India, because of India, China, because two re-emerging economies are very close by. And on top of that, South Asia as a region is very problematic in a sense that the South Asian countries, they try to define themselves what they are not rather than what they are. This is not my statement. I'm quoting the statement of Professor Ashish Nandi. That's what he said. That's that's the nature of the South Asia itself. Again, the state formation process in South Asia is very problematic. Although they share a common heritage, but no country, there are very few countries who appreciate that history of state, history, that the common history that they share. So the region itself is divided in more than one way. They're divided in terms with regard to the language, with the religion, and there are many more factors that divides the region. On top of that, South Asia, as I said earlier, has become an epicenter of geopolitics as well. The Americans have their own interests, Chinese might have their own interests. Now the known powers, with the rise of multipolarity, the powerful countries are trying to create their own centers, there are own types of, the regional blocks. So somehow, because of this trend, the regional integration process in the region is not really going to move, is not really moving ahead. And it's most unlikely that this trend. It's most likely that the same trend will move ahead in the days to come as well. Also, the countries, the South Asian countries, they don't trade. Their economic engagement is also declining during the last couple of years. If you look at the trade between and among countries, except between India and Nepal, or those who are, because we are heavily dependent on India, but they don't really trade among each other. The 5% of the trade happens, within the region. So the large amount of trading happens outside of the region. So that's quite an important part. So if you geopolitically, the region is divided, the one of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the momentum it has brought, the countries have got their own priorities as well. On top of that, the China is trying to develop its. It's not only China; it's other powerful countries as well. They wanted to. They in fact wanted to create their own types of the integration, the own types of the blocks as well. So these all factors does not really provide a positive space for the regional integration in South Asia. Apart from these factors, the most important factor is the conflict, the tension between India and Pakistan. The India and Pakistan that does not allow countries to come together as well, right? So these are some of the important factors that we really need to take into considerations. Also, it's the most the region. If you look at the engagement of the region itself, the people from the region, their engagement is not within the region now. During the last couple of years, the people from the South Asia also they also interact outside the region. Their interaction outside the region have fundamentally increased. So I don't think there is a so there is a conducive environment. There is a the proper approach for the regional integration in the region.
Right, sir. Speaking about sort of increased interactions outside the region, right? And there's so many different blocks in play out here. As you said, it's not an integrated region. It has never been as of such because we're more differentiated than we are united in a lot of significant aspects. When a smaller country like Nepal is situated in such a evolving space, I'd say, right? How do you think the domestic power dynamics impacts or sort of influences its own vision of such evolving trends? And you've spoken about how our foreign policy needs to be more pragmatic, but are we actually clear on how our foreign policy should be curated and directed to actually absorb the impacts of any probable shocks in the future? And I actually also want to come on the India and China question as well, but I want to move with this first.
Okay. The internal, the foreign policy, is largely defined in our case. I think it applies to the other countries as well. Is largely defined by the constitution. There should not be any problem with regard to the foreign policy. The problem arises. The problem only arises when we try to use foreign policy for our own interests rather than the interest of the state. For a long period of time, if you look at the trend, the foreign policy has become a most dividing factors in our case. At least in our case, it does not really unify us. So different the actors they have their own foreign policy. They have their own imagination of foreign policy. For a long period of time, I would argue that whoever comes into the power, they have come up their own type of foreign policy, largely the regime-centric foreign policy. When we have a foreign policy of that kind, that does not really allow us to take a benefit. There are benefits happening around us as well. That does not allow us to work together, right? And that does not also allow us to have a common voice on key issues. Let's take an issue of development, development is needed for Nepal. We all know about that, and we need money, we need investment from outside. But the way the internally, we get divided on the project basis, is a problematic. It was quite reflected in the case of, well manifested in the case of MCC or Belt and Road Initiative projects. So when the country is divided along these developmental lines, or as well, that creates a problem in achieving the objectives of the foreign policy as well, because one of the objective of foreign policy is to create a economic environment as well. It is create a economic well-being of the people as well. So this factor has been, it has been going on there for a long period of time, and we have failed to have a consensus on it. So that, it's not only in the case of Nepal, but largely that applies to the countries, mostly the developing countries as well. Then apart from that, that's where the point of, having a pragmatic foreign policy becomes even more important, rather than delving on the issues like, on these. I think we really need to have a clear cut, foreign policy. Foreign policy lines in terms of implementation or working, that somehow is missing, I would say. And because of all these factors, the political parties or whoever are implementing the foreign policy, they've been using there for their own purpose and objectives. Did I answer your question or not?
Yes, so you did. But I actually want to link it to another question as well. I think it's very interesting. So there are different imaginations of foreign policy. There is no unified idea, is what you're trying to say, right? But which there should be, which should in turn unify us as a country when we project our own image outward, and it is not there. And there is a question of development as well. And as you rightly pointed out, it was seen both in the times of the MCC and the BRI as well.
Yes.
And it always comes up, especially when you talk about our neighbors, right? When India and China sort of factor into our overall considerations, right? So there's been a particular focus on the neighborhood always when we look at Nepali foreign policy, even when we attempt to preach a more balanced or neutral outlook on our international relations, right? In the ever-changing regional and geopolitical tides. So how do India and China factor into Nepal playing a more pragmatic game? Where do fall in the issue?
This is quite an important question, I would say. I think the India has got a neighborhood first policy, although there are problems. So India is facing problems with its neighbor, but the if you look at the role of the neighbors in Nepal's Nepali context is quite an important. So whenever like these both India and China, they are not only the competing powers, but they also have some sort of conflict between them, although there are some sort of, the situation is slightly improving. Disengagement is taking place at the borders, but they also work together often, whenever their interests come together, right? So we can see this in many cases as well. Right? So India and Nepal, I think they during the last couple of years, particularly with the with the arrival of Xi Jinping in China, I would say the Chinese foreign policy somehow has changed, not only towards Nepal but towards its neighbor. China somehow has got a different. Xi Jinping somehow has adopted somehow a different foreign policy approach, and we can see the competition between. It's not really a competition per se, but both China and India, both these countries wanted to have they wanted to maintain their influence in the region. India considers itself as a resident power, the power in the region because it has been there for a long period of time, and so it has got it's called natural alliances or the relationship with the countries in the region. Somehow, the way China is projecting itself in recent years has become a major concern for India as well, because India does not necessarily wanted to leave that space which it has been occupying for a long period of time. For China, because China wanted to become a superpower, or of course they have ambitions, certain ambitions in the global politics. They also wanted to control the region, not necessarily control, but wanted to have some sort of influence in the region. So both of our neighbors have their own, again, I use the word imagination of the region as well. I think their imagination somehow is not only impacting the individual countries, but that imagination is also having impact on the earlier question that you raised, the integration process of the region as well. It's like, so they have a regional perspective of their own perspectives as well. So China has got their own priority in Nepal. It has got its own priority in other countries as well. So same thing goes for India as well. But of course, these countries, every country will have their own priority, and we cannot ask them not to have those priorities, because countries overall, they have their own interests. But the crux, the point here is, do we have any priority in Nepal as a state? What are our priorities? Of course, they all have so when China and India are economically rising, what should be our priority, and how should we try to get benefit out of out of their economic development? That debate somehow is missing here. If you the entire, the discourse, not only the foreign policy discourse, but entire political discourse of Nepal, the economic factor somehow does not really get the priority it deserves. It has to get. So this is these factors are quite important. The third factor, we already have got two neighbors, like then we've also talked about the distant neighbor, or the neighbors, largely the US or the other Western countries or West plus countries. Nepal's engagement with them has fundamentally increased. So there is nothing called the countries of inner circle and countries of outer circle. So if you look at from our perspectives, because we are equally engaging with all these countries. Our engagement with India and China is somehow natural, which is also the linked with the survival of the state. But if you look at the engagement of the people, has fundamentally increased during the last couple of years. So my point, what I wanted to argue here is the foreign policy of there's some sort of the mismatch between the foreign policy of the state and the priority of the people. We've not really been able to strike a fine balance between these two factors.
So what I am hearing is that we need to get our priorities straight.
Yes.
In these turbulent waters, right? Regardless of where others and their priorities fall.
Of course.
So I think you actually touched upon the role of political actors in this, right? And how fragmented they've been, how it's been very regime-oriented when foreign policy actually plays out, or when it is imagined. I actually want to come into a more academic section. You have been working in the development sector for a considerable amount of time now.
Yeah.
And as such, you have been privy to a much more nuanced understanding of narrative construction and projection regarding Nepal's foreign policy, as you've already spoken about, and as we can also hear. The foreign policy dilemmas, right? So how do the intellectual or academic community actually contribute to these narrative construction and projection? How do you perceive the role of thought leaders and institutions?
I think it's quite an important question again. You see, the nation states are built on narratives, right? narrative plays important role in the life of the states, as it does in the life of the people. Somehow, the we really have not been able to develop our own narrative of foreign policy on narratives. The some of the narratives that are floating around in the academic world. The one of them is the small state, buffer state, survival strategy, proximity, the equidistance and things like that. I don't think they do not necessarily help Nepal, because or a prisoner of geography. These narratives, these are the narratives not developed by the scholars who do not have much to do with this country. Sorry to say that, but somehow we've not really come up with our, as I said earlier, own narrative. Every country, whether they are, no country will say, it's itself will categorize itself as a small state or a weak state. It's like, they have their own history, they have their own cultural heritage, civilizational heritage, they have their own comparative advantage. Like, so we somehow have not really been able to work on those comparative advantage or those opportunities which are available. Like, we have been largely stuck in the debate that was floated a long time back by the scholars, which does not allow us to move ahead. The survival strategy, I just wanted to point out one here. That was, this was developed by Leroz during 70s, I think. That survival strategy somehow forces us to see our neighbors from a different perspectives. Like, it always creates, if not a real fear, at least a psychological fear. Like, so we really need to get out of it. The other one is the prisoner of geography or landlockedness. I think the technology provides a lot of opportunities opportunities, and these opportunities are quite helpful for countries like Nepal to come out of these types of, the landlockedness, the dilemma that we have been stuck for a long period of time. Then I think the countries, there are smaller countries in the world in terms of size, but they have done fairly well in terms of economic development or their influence in the world politics. We can talk about countries like Qatar, we can talk about Singapore, we can talk about other countries as well, or the countries from the Scandinavian region who are smaller in size, but they're punching above the weight. People look at. I think that we also have got that potential. I don't say we don't have anything, but it entirely depends how do we want to project ourselves in the days to come. So again, I want to repeat that the foreign policy in a lot of countries in the world, it's the foreign policy that unites them. When we talk about China, it's a China. I'm not really supporting the Chinese political system, but the way, the Chinese foreign policy has benefited China, and that's the foreign policy that has allowed China to become a powerful country. The American foreign policy has made American exceptionalism. The foreign policy somehow in the neighborhood, India, they're also not divided with regard to the foreign policy. Of course, there are some problems in recent years, but largely they have been united. The foreign policy unites them. But ours is the foreign policy. It's only the foreign policy that divides us. If we look at from 1950 onwards, from the for the considerable amount of period of time, we have been divided along foreign policy. Then it's not only the foreign policy, now we're going to be divided along the geopolitical lines as well. So if we really wanted to keep all these things in order, I think there is a need, there is a time for us to have a foreign policy that really works for the people, and that really works for that really benefits this country.
Right, so definitely. I think you've hit the nail in the head, so to speak. Actually want to, as we near the end, I actually want to, because you've raised a very interesting point, and it's something that I think a lot of academics who've been trained in Nepal sort of experience, the survivalist strategy that has sort of survived, so to speak, for a very long time in the academic narratives of the intellectuals in this country, right? It is something that I have unfortunately propagated in a lot of instances. It is something that I've heard being propagated to me in a lot of other instances. Why do you think has it sort of survived in our narrative construction so much?
I personally, if you talk to me, the survival strategy somehow is not really a good approach from my point. Am I answering your question or not?
Yes,
Uh,
sir.
it does not really benefit us. We need to survival strategy. It always it poses a question: where are the threats coming from? So we always see our neighbors, the immediate neighbors or neighbors beyond that, from a threat perceptions only. So when we look at the neighbors or from a threat perceptions only, that does not allow us to have a friendly relations with them. Right, we always look at each other from a different angle, so we don't have a positive image about them. So if we carry that image for a long narrative for a long period of time, I think it will not really be helpful. So the point here is to have a academic analysis of these the concept which has been floated over the period of time. So how impactful, they are, what impact they have created in our foreign policy realm. I think we'll have to look into these factors as well. Again, the most important factor is, I think, most of the jargons that we have been using in the foreign policy, balance of power, a lot of things, they may not be suitable in our context because these ideas were developed entirely in a geography which has been in conflict for a long period of time, and that reality does not really exist in this part of the world.
Right, definitely. So I think there is hope to be had that that the academic, the intellectual community sort of moves forward from this analysis, from calling ourselves small and moving into a more strategic outlook towards our foreign policy, towards a more pragmatic outlook, as you said. So I think this was an incredibly insightful talk, sir, as it always is when I hold a conversation with you. You always bring such interesting points. I go back and I reflect on them, and I hope the audience also gets that chance when they go through this video. Thank you very much for joining
Thank
us,
you.
sir, for the session.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, sir. And